No, she hasn't touched it.
Let's go ahead and get started. And I would appreciate you guys throwing a quick prayer up for me. All of a sudden, the last about 20 minutes, I am not feeling at all well. And one of the things I've just realized I've done a very poor job is I have made no arrangements whatsoever for any backups. Backup teacher for this class. So I'll try to address that next week. But we'll try to get through it. Helen, do you mind opening us in prayer? And the answer is obviously yes, she does.
Father, we thank you that you give us the chance again to gather together and learn your word. Please bless Kenny. Well, he has been working so hard, and especially last night he stayed up till 2:30, I guess, to prepare for this class. So just help him to just be in good shape. Bless his health and help him to speak whatever you want him to tell us, and prepare us, prepare our heart. Help us to open our hearts, open our eyes, and learn whatever you want us to learn. And learning about Job, that's a very important lesson in all our lives, because we all have sufferings. For little kids, maybe not yet, but definitely they will be faced with that too. So we just thank you for the chance for bringing us together here. Please be with us all the time, and Holy Spirit, help our teacher Kenny. In Jesus' name we pray.
All right. So, the week before Christmas, I put sort of 4 questions up there and said we'll discuss them, but I'll give you a couple of weeks to think about it. And actually last week we only made it through 3 before running out of time, which was great. So that leaves us with the 4th one. So we'll finish that 4th one, and again, I have no idea how long that will take. We will go until it feels like we're not getting anything useful done. And if it doesn't take a whole hour, then we'll start talking about the character of Job himself. Was everybody here last week? Pretty much everybody was here last week. It's hard. These 2 weeks are difficult for so many people go on vacation. So if we were here last week, we did those. That leaves us with, is it wrong to ask God why? So Job gets quite a lecture from God when God finally shows up. At least at first reading, it looks very much like Job gets in a lot of trouble for daring to ask God why all this stuff is happening to him. What Job keeps saying is, all I want is for God to come, explain himself. And when God shows up, God does not explain himself. He basically makes it clear that Job didn't have any business asking. So the place where we want to start with the discussion is, obviously, when something tragic happens, our natural impulse is to say, God, what are you doing? Do you remember the Christmas pageant this year? I lost it. What's Cece's wife's name? Carol's mother's name. What is her name? I can't remember. Anyway, if you saw the Christmas pageant, there was a long testimony from a couple in the church who, a few years ago, 20 years ago, I think, lost their 14-year-old daughter in a tragic car accident. And one of the things that she said was, well, the first few weeks, I kept asking, loving God, where are you in all this? So the natural response is to say, why did you let this happen? Now, Job at least seems to get into some trouble for telling God, just please come explain yourself. And God doesn't explain himself. So, was it wrong for Job to ask? Or is it sometimes wrong and sometimes right? Or is it something where Job, there's a right way and a wrong way to ask the question, and Job asked the wrong way? If that's true, how do we make sure we're asking the right way, right? If it's always wrong, well, we're going to want to ask the question, what are we supposed to do when we feel that urge if it's wrong to ask, right? Yet another of these very open-ended questions that it's going to be hard work for you to answer. But that's where we're going to start, is trying to work through that. Is it okay to ask God why, and is there a right way and a wrong way, and how do we go about doing it, right? So I didn't bother with stickers today because I learned last week that I can't ever predict where anyone's going to sit. So just sort of divide up sort of half and half, I guess. And go. All right, let's get back together. Thank you very much. This time they finished first, so they had some warning to pick somebody to share what the group said, and you guys have until they get finished to pick somebody to share what your group talked about. So, who are we listening to?
So we kind of, well, there was sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And so what, if it's alright, how do we make sure we're asking the right thing? So one of the, should I say answers? Is that we ask God in a humble way, not like not in blaming him kind of way, but we can ask like what if there's something that we can learn from the painful experience, whether it's like maybe to refine us, and through the experience maybe we can bring him glory, but yeah, just not in blaming kind of way.
Very good, thank you. Guys, and if you had a chance to talk about it, you can tell us. And don't worry about it. What about you guys?
I monopolize the conversation so often. We had mentioned that there are right ways and wrong ways, pretty similar to the other group. And then somebody else also mentioned that that for sake of closure, basically, it's you need to answer. You need to ask that question. Get a sense of closure to the incident. I shared a little bit about my personal experience, and I think that for some of you that were here last week in my group, I shared about I lost my second daughter about 5 years ago at age 7 from a brain tumor, and so kind of going through these kinds of questions where it was not an intellectual exercise for me. And so I think that, and I mentioned that I studied quite a bit of theology and all that, I think, prior to the incident happening, and I think that helped me. I think, through that scenario. And so there are certain questions that I didn't ask, and one of them is, why did you let it happen to me? And I think that I'm a physician, and I see a lot of things that happen to other people, diagnosed and all that. So, but in that sense, you know, I was surprised when it happened to me, because it does happen to other people, but I didn't ask God, like, okay, well, why me and not somebody else, or just whatever. And I think that I was very aware of God's grace, in the sense that, you know, everything good that happens truly is from Him, okay? And so when things don't go my way, you know, do I feel like, you know, somehow that I've done something? I've never had that kind of guilt, you know, of that. You know, it just was that, that's just the way things are. You know? And we see it all around us, even though that it's removed, you know, in the newspapers, you know, people getting shot, people having just incidents happen to them. You know, their 2-year-old baby takes a gun and shoots their mother, or just, you know, just things happen to people. And if nothing's happened to you, thank God that it hasn't. You know, by His grace, it hasn't. But should you expect your whole life that nothing like that will happen to you? You know, and if it does, is it your fault or God's fault, or, you know, whatever? You know, and to me, I just never had those kinds of questions, you know. But having said that, my understanding of God, you know, or my feeling towards God has changed. And it's something that, you know, it's 5 years later, I'm still kind of, you know, processing. And so anyways, to kind of, in short, basically, I've kind of reinforced my idea of God as a sovereign, powerful, and in many ways distant God. You know, the closeness and the, you know, that kind of loving aspect, almost the maternal attributes of God, I think, are not as strong. And so, in a nutshell.
There's, I want to go a little further with something you said about about how having studied the theology in advance made a difference. I started out my career as a futures trader, which is it's a business where about 10%, it's a zero-sum game, and about 90% of the people fail, which means that if you're one of the 10% of the people that succeed, you get the other 90 people's money. So if you succeed, you can make a lot of money. But when you look at what makes the 90% fail, it is rarely because they were stupid and didn't have good ideas, because most of the people who get involved in it practice first. They come up with an idea of how they're going to trade, and they paper trade. And if they lose money paper trading, they don't gamble real money on it. So they get involved when they paper traded and they've been successful and their system works or whatever, and then they get in. And usually when they fail, it's not because their system doesn't work. It's because as soon as real money is on the line, they can't follow the system. And what you have to tell yourself to succeed as a futures trader is when the market, you buy, and it will do this to you. You will buy, and as soon as you buy it, it will start going down. And you know it's got to go up. You know that the price is too low. And it keeps going down. And you've got the place where you said, if it gets to here, I'm wrong, and I'll get out. And it gets down to that point. And you're sure it's going to turn around any moment. If you get out now, you will have lost a lot of money. Now, when the people are paper trading, they will get out. But in real life, they will tell themselves, I know it's going to turn around, because people hate to lose money. And what you have to tell yourself as a futures trader is, when I didn't have any money on the line and my emotions weren't involved, I was smarter then than I am now. So I need to trust the me that was then rather than the me that is now, because my emotions don't make it possible for me to think clearly. And the ones who are successful are the ones who do what they had decided they were going to do then, rather than saying, I know it's going to turn around, I'm not going to sell. If we get into something like what Job went through, or what Carol's parents went through, or what Henry's gone through, if we get into that and then start trying to make sense of it, that's pretty late. And you're going to have a very, very difficult time trying to make sense of it because your mind's not working well. You're overwhelmed with the emotions. One of the reasons that you go to the trouble to study the Bible before you need it is that when you need it, it's usually too late to study. Does that make sense? You want to have studied it so that when it happens, you're prepared and you're not now trying to figure it out. You can say, I know none of this feels true, but I've been through this already and I've asked the questions, and I'll stick with the answers that I had. That at least gives you that option. Maybe the feelings are too strong, you can't, but at least you have that option. It's a very good thing. What you will probably find is that you have asked the tough question and you've come up with an answer that's a nice, facile answer, and then you get in the situation and you realize, oh, it's more complex than I thought, or whatever, but at least the basic answer is there and it's in place, and it's a place that you can start from. Now, both groups agreed, I think, that there's a right way and a wrong way to ask, which I also think is true. There's a right way and a wrong way to use a clicker as well, apparently. All right. I want to talk for a while about presuppositions and questions. Very, very rarely do we ask a question without at the same time implicitly making a statement. That's what a presupposition is, and the classic example is, when did you stop beating your wife? And I never stopped beating my wife is a very bad answer.
Or I'm beating her now. Worse.
There's a problem. There's a problem. Obviously, the question implies that there was a period in which you beat your wife, and there is no good answer to this question other than I never beat my wife in the first place, right? So that's an obvious question that gets used in logic problems. There's an obvious logical presupposition embedded in this, and those are bad. But the more dangerous things are relational presuppositions. Do you remember the Sadducees who notoriously didn't believe in a resurrection at all, coming to Jesus and asking him a trick question about the woman who went through 7 husbands, one after another, and they all died, and then finally she died, and then they say, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Now, there's a logical presupposition. Look, their whole point, this was a reductio ad absurdum. They thought they were proving that the whole idea of a resurrection was ridiculous. Their idea was that there isn't any answer to this question because there isn't any such thing as a resurrection. Right, that was their point in asking. They didn't really want to know whose wife she would be in the resurrection because they didn't think there was going to be a resurrection in the first place. It's a trap question. It's a trick question. It's not a real question. Jesus addresses their logical presupposition, which is that if you get raised from the dead, you'll be raised back into an earthly life just like this one, and you'll pick up where we started, pick up where we left off. In other words, when the Sadducees imagined a resurrection, they were imagining a resurrection like Lazarus's. Right? And Jesus answers them and says, in the resurrection, people neither marry nor given in marriage. They're like the angels in heaven. The resurrection is a resurrection to a completely different type of life. You have misunderstood what a resurrection is. But there is also, in their question and in how they asked it, there is a relational presupposition, which is they think of themselves as the experts and of Jesus as someone who needs to pass their examination. And Jesus also addresses their relational one. He starts off by saying, you err because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. The very first thing he says is, you people are not experts. And then he turns it around on them, right? And so he addresses the logical presupposition, but also the relational one. And usually it's the relational presuppositions that matter. What did I ever do to make you fall so out of love with me that I'm not even important enough to you for you to take the trouble to remember when our anniversary is? Right? There's a whole lot of presuppositions built into this, right? And obviously there's, you're not in love with me anymore and I'm not important enough to you. There's, the reason you forgot our anniversary is because you didn't take any trouble. Notice this one. Notice the difference between, what's the function of ever? What does the word ever do in this? What's the difference between what did I ever do and what did I do?
Self-defending.
Yeah, basically, if I say, what did I ever do, it takes what did I do, which is a question, and turns it into, I never did anything. Right? Saying, what did I ever do, implies, in English, the way English is used, it implies, I never did anything to you. Right? In other words, the reason that the way we ask questions matters is that the way we ask questions is how we communicate the presuppositions. Okay? Right. So, I would bet a whole lot of money that everyone in this room, when they read this, that there wasn't a single person who imagined this as a husband talking to his wife. Because we are really good at reading presuppositions, right? Even when we can't formulate them. You guys had a whole lot of trouble coming up with a way to articulate what the impact of ever was in that sentence. But I'll guarantee you, you know the difference between someone saying, what did I do? And someone saying, what did I ever do? Even if you couldn't articulate it, you know the difference, right? Also the other thing is that I suspect that most of the guys in here, our basic reaction was, well, I don't know this couple, but I bet you that one thing that she did is she asked him a whole bunch of these kind of questions. Because this is not a request for information, right? This is an attack. This is an attempt to establish dominance in the relationship, right? This is a relational tactic. It is not a question. And only a very stupid man would start, and there are lots of men who are stupid, but only a very stupid man would start saying, well, it's not that I didn't take any trouble. I had put it in my iPhone, right? It's just the battery died on my iPhone, right? That would be a disaster, because you're basically saying, okay, I grant you that I'm not in love with you anymore, that you're not important to me, right? The important thing is the presuppositions, and wise people go to the presuppositions first. This is, if you've ever studied people who study verbal abuse, they actually have words for this. This is the bait, right? The thing at the end, it's the bait. It's the thing that the foolish person responds to. And it's set up there to get you to respond to that and implicitly concede these, and the moment you have, you've lost in the war that this person is fighting. So the presuppositions matter, and they matter both logically and relationally. One of the things, Mary couldn't be here today. She was actually, it's unfortunate she couldn't be. I was going to give her a chance to give it from her perspective rather than mine, because as a parent, you spend a lot of time listening to your kids and listening for the presuppositions, right? And so you ask a bunch of questions like, okay, so your kids are fighting over, you know, whether World War II ended in 1945 or 1946, and they're screaming at each other over it, right? They're furious about it. And so you say, now, why do you think this is important enough to fight about? Right? You know, you try to get them to see all the things that they're fundamentally assuming, because if you think the issue is 1945 or 1946, you don't understand the issue, right? So and I can explain it to you from the perspective of the guy constantly trying to get people to think of the presuppositions. Mary could have told you what it's like to be on the receiving end of someone who's always trying to say, now, what's the presupposition? The difference between a demand and a request is the relational presupposition. And Job does not ask God for answers, he demands answers from God. Job's attitude is pretty much, you owe me an answer, why haven't you given me one yet? Now, I think God clearly has an answer. Jethro gives us an answer. But the trouble is, and again, if you had kids, you know that your kid can come to you, and there's a big difference between your kid saying, why can't I play in the front yard? And your kid saying, why can't I play in the front yard? Right? And the difference is precisely that. The first one, the only issue there is the kid wants to know what the reason is that they can't play in the front yard. But in the second one, there's an attitude problem, and the attitude problem takes precedence. Right? And you deal with the attitude problem. If Job had asked humbly, then maybe he gets an answer. Given that Job asked the question in a way that made it clear that he presumptuously assumed that God owed him an answer, God chose not. If God gives him an answer, God validates his presumption that God owed him one. You see what I mean? And God doesn't choose to encourage that illusion. Now, it doesn't mean that if Job had asked politely, he would have gotten an answer. Because there might have been other reasons for God not answering. But demanding an answer from God, instead of asking for one, reveals an issue in how we relate to God. But I do want to point out one other thing before we move on about this, and that is that Job doesn't actually get in trouble for asking this question. Job says very honestly what he feels. And his honest expression of what he feels reveals that he thinks God owes him an explanation. And that is not true. Very well, the issue has been raised. God now proceeds to deal with the issue. But you will notice that Job does not get punished for this. Right? If you look at chapter 42, so God shows up out of the storm, he talks to Job, he makes it very clear that Job has no business demanding an answer or setting himself up in judgment over God or trying to subpoena God into court or anything else. And Job gets the point and says, I was out of line, he humbles himself, he repents, and God does not say, all right, fine, sacrifice a bull to me, to atone for your sin, and we'll be okay. Did you notice that? Job does not get punished for asking this question. The issue gets straightened out, but there's not actually any evidence that God was particularly mad at Job for asking the question. He just straightens the problem out. Having straightened the problem out with Job, God then turns to Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and says, you guys are in trouble. Job doesn't actually get in trouble in the fundamental sense, right? And to go back to my kids again, if my kids, they ask a question that has an attitude problem, it reveals an issue that needs to be dealt with. I think most of the kids, by the time they get to be 17 or 18, that's most of mine now, it's 6 of the 9, that they figured out that a stern lecture from me does not mean that I'm angry. And it certainly doesn't mean that I don't love them or that they're not or that they're in danger of being disowned. It means there's an issue that needs to be resolved. But when we resolve the issue, then we're done. That's good, we can move on. They are not in trouble, although they may be about to get disciplined. Do you see the difference? They're not in relational problems. They have not harmed the relationship by telling me honestly what they feel. It may have revealed some issues we have to address, but the relationship is fine. Okay? There's not any anger or any relational stress. Job deals honestly with God, and we're going to spend some time in a later session talking about Job's honesty compared to his friends. One of the differences is that Job is at least dealing honestly with life, while his friends are just sort of pretending that nothing that doesn't fit their theology ever actually happens. Right? God does not object to Job's honesty. Job's honesty makes it possible for him to deal with the issues that's there and move on. And so, if we ask God, why did you let this happen? Even if we ask him without a very good attitude, we may get disciplined, but we don't get in trouble. And I hope you can see the distinction that I'm trying to make. God does not object to honesty. Honesty means now we can resolve stuff. Okay? I hope that makes sense. All right. Now, 20 minutes. We'll see how far we can do this. So we want to talk about so now a complete change of gears. This is where we go into sort of theater class. We want to talk about bringing Job's character into focus, and I want to make sure you guys understand why it's actually important to do this sort of theater class exercise, and not just for Job. It's just as important with the Gospels, for example. If you had some actor and you told him you were going to play Job, then stereotypically they will say, what's my motivation? Now the reason that actors want to know what the motivation is that, so you remember me saying, that you guys couldn't necessarily articulate the difference between what did I do and what did I ever do, but you could tell, right? I don't necessarily trust the exact numbers, but there are basically studies of human communication that about 10% of what gets communicated when people talk to each other face to face, like I'm talking now, about 10% of this very sentence that I'm saying now, I'm trying to go all meta, is the words, the logical meaning of the words. What you would get if I wrote you a note instead of telling you. And then 20, 30%, something like that, has to do with the tone of voice. More than half of what gets communicated in conversation is communicated by the body language. The thing is, very few people consciously try to control their body language. The reason that we subconsciously pay so much more attention to someone's body language than we do to the actual words that come out of their mouth is that the body language is way more honest. Right? The body language, because you can think really carefully about what comes out of your mouth and what you say, and there are a lot of people who can control how they say it, but there are very few people who aren't professional actors who are so self-aware that they can control the body language that they use to control what they tell you. And so we mostly pay attention to body language. But the reason actors want to know about motivation is precisely because it isn't chosen. What happens is whatever story you're telling yourself in your mind about why the person's doing what they're doing, that's what comes out in your body language, right? And that's what most of the people pick up on. So I think J.K. Rowling, when Alan Rickman was chosen to play the role of Severus Snape in the first movie, and there were still 3 books to go that she hadn't published, she took him aside in private, swore him to secrecy, and then told him everything that she knew about the character. Because if she hadn't, he would have made something up, whether he consciously did or not, and played it that way, and quite possibly have taken the character in a direction that wasn't compatible with where she was going to take him. Because if we don't think about it, we still fill it in. We tell ourselves stories about why people do the things that they do all the time, whether we mean to or not. if we don't do it consciously and we don't think about what we're doing, our subconscious fills it in, which is how you get things like somebody saying, I know he's mad at me. I have no idea why. I don't know what I did. Well, almost always that's because it's not what you did, it's the story the person is telling himself about why he thinks you did what you did. It's the motives that he's imputed to you. And we do that. Usually, if we don't think about it, there's a basic default rule that we use to impute motives to other people. Do you know what that is? Our natural assumption is...
Projection, probably.
Exactly. Our natural assumption is that they are like us. So what our subconscious naturally does is it says, what would I have to be feeling or doing in order to act like that? And then we assume that's why they're doing it. This is one of the reasons why accusations generally tell you a whole lot more about the person making the accusation than they tell you about the accused. Very few people are actually very good at figuring out why other people do things. And so when someone says, well, she's only doing that because she hates me and wants to be more popular than I am, the chances that that's why the other person's doing it are not very good, but usually it means that the person making the accusation really wants to be popular. Do you see what I mean? Now, the problem with this is when we come to Scripture, whenever we're reading David and Absalom, or we're reading Job, or most dangerously when we're reading the Gospels and we're reading what Jesus does, look, when you're reading the Scripture out loud, if I gave you guys the story of Jesus with the woman at the well, or Jesus with the guy at the pool, or whatever, and I asked you to read it, when you got to Jesus' lines, you wouldn't read them in a monotone, right? You would put tone of voice and inflection. But tone of voice and inflection is how we communicate how the person feels about the people he's dealing with, what's going on, right? So, and I'm going to use myself as an example of how big a problem this can be if you're not conscious about it. When I was a teenager, I was pretty good at giving grace to sinners. But I had a major problem with charity. There was one group of people that absolutely enraged me. I would just get furious and it would take 10 or 15 seconds, and that was stupid people. I could not stand stupid people. And having a very high opinion of my own intelligence, as I did at the time, most of the people I knew I kind of thought were stupid, so that was kind of a big issue. What that means is, when I read, so I'm going to read you the story of Jesus talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as I would have read it in my head without thinking about it, as I did read it when I was 17. So when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, one of the things that happens all the time with Jesus is Jesus says something and he stops and he doesn't explain it. And then what the disciples always do is they wind up huddling up and saying, what do you think he meant by that, right? And it becomes comic at one point because they're so used to doing that there's a point where Jesus gets them together and he says, now, we're going to go to Jerusalem. And then the chief priests and the elders are going to arrest me and crucify me. But then I'm going to rise from the dead. And then they all get together and say, what do you think he means by that? Because they never know what he means by anything. And they get in their little groups and they try to talk it and they usually get it wrong. So in this case, again, they discussed this among themselves and said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you picked up? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you picked up? How is it possible that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, that's the way Jesus talked to his disciples in my head all through the years that I was a teenager. I was not aware that I was making an interpretive choice. Okay? That's just how he talked to them. Now, I've spent the last 25 years raising children. Right? So now, when I read it, it sounds more like this. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You have little faith. Why are you talking amongst yourselves about having no bread? You still not understand? Look, don't you remember 5 loaves, 5,000 people? How many basketfuls you picked up? Or 7 loaves, 4,000 people? How many basketfuls you picked up? How do you not understand? I wasn't talking to you about bread. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Right? Now, those are exactly the same words. But it's the difference between Jesus reacting to his disciples the way I reacted to stupid people that I didn't like, and the difference between Jesus feeling about his disciples the way I feel about my kids. I'm pretty confident the second one is more accurate. My point is, when I was a teenager, I did not realize that I was, in effect, accusing Jesus of feeling about his disciples the way I felt about stupid people. But that is what we do if we don't make ourselves think about what we're doing. Okay? So, when we come to Job, we want to actually think about it. We want to be conscious. We want to actually look at what's there rather than just turning Job into an ancient Israelite version of ourselves, which is what we will do if we're not careful. And we will turn Jesus into a version of ourselves. We will turn the people in the Bible into lots of different versions of ourselves rather than who they actually were if we don't know that that's what we'll do if we're not careful about it. So what you have to make sure, first of all, Job needs to be a real person and he needs to interact with the people around him the way real people interact. Okay? It's surprising how often we read the Bible and we think of Bible characters as sort of Bible characters instead of real people. And sort of, it's almost like different rules apply to Bible characters. Dorothy Sayers talks about this, about her discovery that the people in the Bible were actually real people instead of like flannel board cutouts. And the second is, you have to start with a text. You have to actually start by looking and seeing what's in the text. Do you remember me talking in the very first session about how we fail to read a story because we already have a story we like telling, and we project it onto it, and as soon as we've subconsciously decided that's the kind of story, then it's like we can't even, then the parts that don't fit become invisible, right? We just edit it out. So you need to start with what's in the text. So I'm going to, I'm going to give you my take. We won't finish it today, and we'll pick it up tomorrow. But you can at least see where I'm trying to get you to go. And the last slide is that, you know, I'd really prefer for you not just to take my version of it and say, wow, that's cool. I'd really prefer for you to do the trouble to decide how you would play Job. But this is how I would play Job. And it starts with the thing that has always really struck me about Job, and I don't see this in many of the commentaries, and I'm not sure why. But you know how the people you deal with in your life, right? There's ever so often at work, you come around someone who's a really nice guy, just a really good person, and they're good at unconditional love, and no matter how you treat them, they're a nice person, right? And then there's also, so maybe say there's 10% of those people, and then there's also some people who are just jerks, and it doesn't matter how nice you are to them, the moment that they think that they can get what they want by stabbing you in the back, you're hosed, right? And you can't affect how those people behave, because they're going to be who they are no matter what you do. Maybe that's another 10%. But most people, how they treat you is determined by how you treat them. Most people are relationally reactive. And so if you want to understand, a very good place to understand what kind of person someone is to start by saying, how do the people around him treat him? How do the people around him react to him? Because that is primarily a function of how he treats people. So, I am in the habit, if you're dealing with a novel or a play, of when I'm trying to understand a character, of looking at how the other people treat him. And as soon as you start doing this with Job, to me at least, something just jumps out of the thing, which is that you've got this very righteous, really generous person who's always helping people, he's upright, he's honest, he's this great guy. Why doesn't anybody love Job? There is nobody in this story who treats Job with any love at all, setting aside God. None of the human characters, in this story show Job any love at all. Now look, there's one set of people that Job appears to have treated really badly, and it's in chapter 30, the first 8 verses of chapter 30, Job sort of openly admits that there's a class of poor people who were so poor that they were reduced to eating weeds in order to survive, and that his attitude towards them was, I wouldn't let those people hang out with my dogs. And Job clearly doesn't think there's anything wrong with it. And we can talk a little bit about why he might not think that, but he certainly helped lots of widows and orphans, but there's a group of people that he held in contempt, and he didn't bother to hide the fact that he held them in contempt. And those people are happy to have the chance to even the score. So you can understand that. That's easy. You can understand why those people love the opportunity to kick Job while he was down. But what about all of these people he helped? Right? You look at the list of when Job is defending himself, and God doesn't say, oh no, that's not true. Right? Job has helped people who were starving. He's gotten involved when there were widows or orphans that were being cheated, and he's gotten justice for them. Right? So where are these people? Where are all these people who you would think would be grateful to Job? What, there's not even one 22-year-old young wife that 7 years ago he kept her from being sold into slavery, and she wants to show up and bring him a bowl of soup? I mean, seriously, nobody shows up to repay the debt of gratitude. And there were bunches of people who should have been grateful. Job's friends are proverbial for being terrible friends. Job's wife, the support that she gives him, you're familiar with suicide by cop. She wants him to commit suicide by God, curse God and die. And the last one, I kind of figured you guys will laugh about this because it's on a much lower scale, but Job's kids. I realize they're dead for most of the thing, and can't be expected to do much of anything. But they're not dead when the thing starts. And I don't know if you've noticed, but Job's kids never invite him to their birthday parties. I realize that seems like a small thing, but it seems like a small thing if you're used to thinking of people as Bible characters rather than as real people. According to the text, Job's sons, whenever they had a birthday, they would throw a big party and they would invite their brothers and their sisters. I can't imagine throwing a party and inviting my sister, assuming that my parents and sisters live reasonably clear. I can't imagine inviting my sister and not inviting my parents. Set aside the disrespect. I like my parents. They're fun to have around. The reason that a messenger has to come and tell Job, oh, all your kids are dead, is that he wasn't at the party. And these were habitual parties. and he wasn't on the list. We are used to thinking of Job as a good and godly man. And Job was a pious man. But I think the fact that Job is in the Bible and he's listed as one of the good men in the Bible tends to blind us to the fact that Job has precisely 0 functional human relationships. And we habitually blame it all on his friends. His friends are terrible friends, right? How could Job's friends be so bad? But look, when everybody behaves in a way to a man that makes you think, why would they treat him like that? The answer is probably something to do with him. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean he's a bad person, and in point of fact, Job isn't. What it does mean is that there is an issue with personal relationships. And if when we picture Job, we picture a guy that is completely abandoned by everybody he knows in his time of greatest need, and it's all their fault and doesn't have anything to do with him, we are not doing justice to the text. Not treating Job like a real person. Now, the answer to the question, why doesn't anybody love Job? There may be more than one answer that could work. But it is a question that we need to answer. Because Jethro wrote a drama. Because the personal relationships in this book matter a lot to the guy who wrote the book. This is not just a book about why God allows Job to suffer even though he's a righteous man. It is also a book about why this righteous man is completely 100% failed by all the people that you might expect to be with him to comfort him. And it is not just his friends who failed him, it is everyone. All right? And I think I'll stop there so you get a week to think about that. This is not where I intended to stop, but we're close to the time to stop, and I think I'll give you guys a chance to think about it. We've got 2 or 3 minutes. Anyone, if there's any questions or anything else you guys want to raise, we can talk about that for a couple of minutes, or you can escape early. We've got about 5 seconds. I need an oxygen hammer. Going. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for your love. We thank you for your revelation of your love in Jesus. We thank you when we read the book of Job and see so little awareness of love. We thank you that your revelation in Jesus has shown us how much you love us, and how much easier it is for us to see that you love us than it was for Job or the people of his time to understand not just how you could love them, but simply that you love them in the first place. And we pray that we would live this next week in a full awareness of your love for us. Through Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.
I was thinking about whenever someone asks a question, one have to make some assumptions. Like before you ask a question, someone asks you a question but doesn't understand it.
If there's a mismatch, presupposition.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
I see it from Ben by.
I always do.
That's right. That's right.
Get the connection, get the same assumption. at the same.
That's exactly right.
I've been reading about.
The percentage of arguments in which people are talking right past each other because they're actually arguing about two completely different issues, and getting
Exactly.
angrier and angrier at each other.
Because they don't
just
understand
huge.
each other's view, their assumption,
That's
He's gone.
the presupposition. It is an absolutely indispensable relational skill to train yourself to
look beyond.
listen for the presupposition, especially when you feel yourself getting angry.
Yeah.
Just step back and listen for the presupposition. There's a rule that I've read it with connection counseling, which is whenever someone says something that's obviously not true, try to imagine
Why this?
a way in which it could be true.
So many
Try to
people
imagine a
think
context
they
in
know.
which it could be true.
No Chinese.
Because from where they're sitting, it's true. Alright, so clearly what they're saying, unless they're outright lying, but usually people aren't outright lying. Right? And if they are, you'll figure out eventually that you're dealing with an outright liar. But in ordinary relationships, people will say something that's flagrantly untrue.
That.
Before you assume that they have bad motivations, try to figure out a place that you could be mentally sitting where that thing could be true. You know, very, very difficult discipline to develop and absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's very, very few people can do it.
Now, nobody does it perfectly,
Yeah.
Probably need to
But,
put that down, because God, I don't.
but you can learn and once you develop the habit, it's not as hard as you would think. It's not really mind reading.
Daddy, daughter.
It's just start with the assumption that you're dealing with a reasonable person who doesn't intend to lie to you. That's actually a remarkably difficult assumption for us to start with.
Saturday,
Our
February.
natural assumption when
Oh,
someone
no,
says
I'm
something
busy.
outrageous
I'm going
is
to
again
body.
to think, what would my motivation have to be to say that? And since my motivation, I would have to be lying.
$7
That's
for
not true. I would have
Ooh, dance story,
to
dance.
check that motive and here we go.
I will act like his daughter.
So,
Thank you.
oh, my pleasure.
I've always been thinking about whenever we joke, like, I know Job is saying the wrong stuff, and then but God punished those three, but not Job.
Yeah, I know. It's-
Because God in the last few chapters is like, oh, Job, you say this wrong. How can you say that? And God be like, I made all this stuff that you don't understand, and then I was like, oh, Job, by the way, like, make offering for
Well,
this day.
and he specifically says to them, he says, you have not spoken what is true of me the way my servant Job has.
Yeah.
Wait.
I was like,
What he said was true?
Exactly.
No, we will absolutely explore that before we're done.
Have you
Okay.
figured out why
Thank
nobody
you.
loves Joe?
Yes, yeah, so that's what comes
You
next.
have figured out?
Well,
What? Tell me.
That's a demand.
well done. I thought that we're gonna distress
That's a
people.
demand.
Tell me.
Demand.
That was classic. That was classic. We can talk about it in the car.
Yeah, why we get food,
Oh,
let's
actually,
go.
we're in two different cars.
Oh.
Oh yeah, that's true. Because he has the red car. Let's go.
So,
We have
I can-
leftover at home.
I can play the character of Job in a way that makes it very easy to understand why nobody loves him.
I think he's just too strict and too busy serving God. He always had no time for wife, kids. So they didn't bother inviting him because they knew he would not come. I guess.
That's good. That's good. That's exactly the kind of thing. That's exactly the way you're trying to think about it.
But that's not true.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. That fits very well with my take on Job. Job is very pious. He's not good with people.
No.
He obeys God's laws,
Yeah, but he's
but he's not good with people.
But he's like boring and never joke around and you know.
I do not want to give you my
He
answer because
doesn't laugh.
it's what you're doing right now is very, very useful.
He didn't laugh. He didn't laugh
Dad,
like you
you
do.
have a $1.
$1?
He didn't hang out with
It's
me.
$11.
It's 11.
You want a drink, don't you, Kai?
Dad, what? Maybe he's not showing God's love. He's not showing God's love to people. I don't have a. I put it back.
Do you have $1?
So far, I largely agree with everything you're saying.
So far.
Well, ultimately, most people are going to wind up a little bit different. So no actor plays the role the same way twice. But you can tell the difference between an actor who's playing a role that's faithful to the text, and an actor you can just say, okay, he's got that guy all wrong, right? So your mother probably wouldn't play Job exactly the way I would play it, but I think she's got him right.
Okay, so who will go with me?
Kai, I'll go with Dad.
I'll go with Dad.
2-2, because my
I'll go
mom's
with
not
Dad.
his.
I'll go with Dad.
No, well, I'm going to go from here to the office.
Then never mind. Oh, I just see your
Stop,
office. I
I
never
don't
went to your office.
I'm going to go to the office to test a bunch of the code that I wrote the last couple of days at home.
How long?
To know for how long it takes
At
to.
home?
I wrote code at home on Saturday.
Yeah,
so-
yeah.
But now he's going to the office.
But debugging it is hard at home because the debugger
How long
firewalls,
will that take?
it takes however long it takes until there are no more
Okay,
errors.
then I'm gonna go with Helen.
It probably
Okay,
will,
I'm gonna
probably
go.
will take 3 to 4 hours.
So I'm going with Helen.
No, you already made your choice.
No, I didn't, that's not fair, because he said he was going to the
That's
office.
a good
No.
First, can I
That's
get
not-
help carrying stuff down back to the
Yeah,
office and all of that?
Sure, sure.